Welcome to Climate Change in the Pacific. Gillespie noted in 2003 that climate change could no longer be dismissed simply as a theory. Almost 20 years later, the consequences of climate change are quite literally on our doorstep, with low-lying Pacific Island nations in imminent danger of submersion and perhaps ultimately extinction. This presentation will discuss New Zealand's responsibilities to support these Pacific Islands in the face of climate change and what this could, or should, look like, particularly in respect to the well-known sinking nation of Kiribati. Climate change is commonly talked about in terms of environmental factors. The focus on how the global average temperature has increased by 1.1 degrees Celsius, or that sea levels have risen by 20 centimetres. Focusing on these factors seems to posit climate change as less critical and certainly not urgent. After all, a winter that is 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer might not seem like a bad thing. Research by Tahana in 2020 indicates that this stems from an impersonal and Eurocentric approach, and this ignores the very life-changing effects of climate change. For those in Pacific Islands, climate change has placed both the traditional ways of life and the long-term future of culture at risk. This has been compounded by the influence of climate change on destructive weather patterns, like the severe flooding in Fiji in 2009. A study by Barnett and Waters in 2016 found that this flood doubled the number of Fijians living below the poverty line. This is the effect of just one isolated disaster, so the extent that climate change will increase starvation, forced migration, and cultural extinction across the globe seems unfathomable. It seems particularly unfair that those who will be the most impacted by climate change are those who have the least power to enact global change. New Zealand has more global power generally for numerous reasons, including that it is a first world or developed nation. So does it have a responsibility to support its neighbours? Yes, I believe so, and there are a few reasons in particular that I would like to highlight. Firstly, the previous colonisation that New Zealand and other first world nations enacted upon these Pacific Islands means that they are, as Douglas and Cooper noted this year, more vulnerable to climate change. Secondly, Tuvalu, Niue, and the Cook Islands still all fall under the New Zealand realm. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, climate change is a global problem that requires global action. This applies to all nations, not simply to New Zealand. This clip from Anote Tong, the previous president of Kiribati, in his TED Talk, puts this rather succinctly.
And we deal with it as a national problem, which it is not. It is a global issue, and it's got to be dealt with collectively.
So, New Zealand has a clear responsibility, but to what extent? To be clear, no action should diminish the self-determination of the Pacific nations. Action should be in conjunction with them, not done to them or for them. Both Toki's writing in 2016 and Tahana's in 2020 make it clear that the only way to do this is to make decisions from an Indigenous perspective to maintain autonomy. Support and advocacy take advantage of New Zealand's status as a developed nation and could provide climate change refugee visas, funding, or petition other global powers. It seems a moral imperative that New Zealand should walk the walk and forge its own path here by taking decisive action to support its neighbours. It might seem extreme to claim that entire cultures might face extinction if climate change is not remedied, but one does not need to look further than Kiribati to see the extent that climate change can affect a nation. There is worse to come. Modelling shows that Kiribati, which sits at just 2 metres above sea level, will be underwater within 100 years. Without decisive action, it is clear that homes will be lost, nations will suffer, and people will die. In response to the frequently asked question of why they just don't move to higher ground, Anote Tong had this to say in 2015.
Rising sea, they say, well, you can move back. And so this is what I tell them. We move back and we will fall off on the other side of the ocean, okay?
So, how could New Zealand exercise their responsibility and support Kiribati? Currently, New Zealand environmental specialists are investigating whether land can be reclaimed in Kiribati. This would, they posit, give them over 2 centuries free from worry about rising sea levels and protect their way of life and culture. It seems a winning solution. However, it is also an expensive solution and will take over 30 years to complete. Neither Kiribati nor New Zealand alone can afford this. This is where New Zealand's voice could make a huge impact. New Zealand could push the international community to support the development financially. This perhaps radical project could mean the difference between life and death, not just for the Kiribati, but also for other nations facing the effects of climate change. However, there are those who believe that New Zealand's focus should be on our own backyard. Currently, New Zealand is labelled insufficient in their actions against global warming and are not even meeting the requirements of the Paris Agreement to work to keep temperature increases below 1.5 degrees Celsius. A poor current record is not enough to excuse New Zealand from acting at all. New Zealand should increase their actions, both for themselves and for others. Those who believe this, however, suggest that support should be limited to actions that New Zealand can control alone or do not require New Zealand to go cap in hand to the international community. These are fallible, however. There are no easy remedies, and a global problem requires global action. One of the main contributors that exacerbate global warming are the CO2 emissions caused by fossil fuels, so punishing polluters has been pushed as a climate change solution. Fossil fuel companies dedicate over $350 million every year to lobbying against limits being placed on their emissions, so they're unlikely to go quietly. Fighting and enforcing this would require collective global action, which seems challenging given the lack of agreement so far and unlikely given the economic repercussions. As Faisal pointed out in 2010, the world's current wealth has historically been built on carbon emission. However, this does not seem to be the ultimate solution, even if agreement could be reached, as it only looks to the future, not at the current issues places like Kiribati are experiencing. While Australasia could easily absorb the population of the Pacific Islands, mass migration is not a foolproof suggestion either. Despite a focus on those most affected and the possibility of alleviating the issues that current underdevelopment might bring through assimilation, this would likely be at the cost of traditional ways of life and culture. It seems doubtful that removing their autonomy and acting paternalistically would have any other outcome other than reenacting historical colonisation. It seems that there are few quick fixes for climate change, and certainly none for nations like Kiribati. It seems completely unfair that the poorest 10% of the global population contribute a minuscule 0.05% of total carbon emissions, yet bear the brunt of climate change effects, as Oxfam concluded in 2015. As an environmental consultant working on Kiribati states in Walter's 2019 article, the developed world should feel guilty for the part it's played in putting Pacific homes and lives at risk. Not only does New Zealand have a responsibility as a global citizen to limit their emissions and do their part to mitigate climate change, they have a moral duty to provide support to their neighbours. History has proven New Zealand has no problem leading the global community in nuclear disarmament, and as a New Zealander, I hope that this same commitment to what is right can be applied to climate change. Kiwis may be many things, but it is not in our psyche to shirk a duty or a bit of a fight.